Doctors, nurses, EMTs, etc. What's the most shocking thing you've seen after thinking nothing could surprise me anymore? Story 1. This guy kept coming to my unit because he was aspirating on something. He had a tracheostomy and a feeding tube in his stomach, so we were confused why he was being admitted every few weeks for aspiration if he wasn't consuming food orally. We eventually learned that his sister wife, Yes, had been pouring whiskey down his trach. To top it off, he groped or tried to grope every female nurse and tech that had him. Story 2. A patient's insurance company refused to pay for a PET scan. When the patient said they would pay for their own PET scan out of pocket, the insurance company said they would refuse to pay for any treatment, testing, or further workup based on evidence from the PET scan if she paid for it herself. It was the most petty, bullshit, evil thing I've seen insurance do in a long time, and I see them do petty bullshit every day. Edit, it was Martin's Point Insurance. Answer, my wife had a berry aneurysm found incidentally on MRI. She was 38 and had none of the hallmarks of one in which an aneurysm would typically be found. So she was sent to an interventional neurosurgeon who said, in people like you, we usually find these on autopsy. Anywho, surgery was performed and a stent was put in place. Everything went as planned and she was scheduled for a follow-up scan in 6 months. Here's where things get kinky. Her insurance tried to deny coverage for the follow-up scan. It turns out whatever dipshit was reviewing the claim didn't bother to read her demographics and see that she was a 38-year-old non-smoker, etc., and were denying coverage because they don't usually do that for people who develop these things as a course of age and/or lifestyle. Anyways, before she could get them to actually pay attention to what they were doing, she spoke to the appeal representative and said, you can cover the scan, or it'll just keep letting my blood pressure go up until the darn thing bursts, and you can pay for the ER bill. They did eventually look closer at the claim and covered the procedure. Story 3. I think I've mentioned this one in the past. Elderly guy came in the middle of winter. Legs were frozen to mid-thigh, and I mean truly ice block frozen. At the same time, he had a bunch of serious burns all over his torso. His gas had been cut off in the middle of winter. Technically illegal if the gas company has documentation of an elderly or handicapped person in the home. He had been trying to keep warm with an incandescent light bulb. He kept falling asleep and the bulb would fall on him, walking him up and causing small, fairly deep burns. He had immediate lower extremity amputations, rewarming, and went to the burn unit. He ended up dying within a few days. The level of suffering he must have gone through is immense. To this day, it is one of the saddest, most preventable deaths I've ever seen. Story 4. Worked in a NICU. Woman had a very premature baby at home, like 25, 26 weeks gestation. She and her partner decided to put the baby in a tube sock and then in a shoebox to bring it to the hospital. But they got hungry and went through a McDonald's drive-thru with said very tiny baby in his sock box. It wasn't so much that they did the drive-thru, but that they told everyone about it and didn't think it was an interesting choice. Kid turned out reasonably okay. Story 5. 20-year medic. It's actually really hard to say what's the most shocking, but I once had a guy on hallucinogens completely remove all the tissue from his left forearm, took it clear down to the radius and ulna. Dude was just chilling like everything was normal. It was crazy and definitely goes on the list. Answer. It blows my mind that people can do stuff like that when they're on substances. Reminds me of a story I heard about a 6-year-old calling 911 because he saw a zombie, and police initially were going to go have a conversation with him and his parents about misusing 911. But when they were about a block from the kid's house, they found a woman who was doped out of her mind on some kind of substances and who looked very much like a zombie. She had gouged both of her eyes out, with one eyeball still partially attached and hanging out, and she was stumbling around with her bloody hands stretched out in front of her in the stereotypical zombie pose, moaning and mumbling incoherently. Story 6. Psychiatrist here. Had a 6-year-old child with behavioral problems have a breakthrough with his therapist that he feels unloved and needs more affection from his mom. The very next day in his appointment with me, I tell his mother this. He looks at her and she replies with okay and goes back to playing on her phone. As a father, that broke my heart into a million little pieces. I've seen murderers, psychopaths, even interviewed serial killers and seen the dregs of humanity. But a mother ignoring her child's cry for affection in front of me? This is how we create monsters. Answer. I was in a mental hospital at 15 with a girl about the same age, 13 to 15, whose father had violation her for hours, per local paper that it lasts that long. She did not want to testify against him, so she pulled the light out of the wall and all the wires but was not injured. So on another day, when she was going down to see the therapist, she threw herself down the stairs hoping to break her leg. Kids love, for parents can be so much deeper than the parents for the kids sometimes. Oh, and my parents didn't think the person that intimacy abused me would do it again if they just told him not to. Story 7. RRN here. The baby born en route coming from Fort Barchers North. Preemie at 29 weeks, no esophagus, no soft palate, no genitals, severely deformed spine and extremities, only one leg not breathing on their own, and literally none of the organs developed anywhere close to functionally. Mom had a long history of substance abuse, including throughout the pregnancy. No prenatal care, despite her community trying extremely hard. Other children already apprehended. Oh, and mom was hemorrhaging. Big time. Not necessarily the most shocking, but it definitely sticks with me. One of the paramedics that brought them was absolutely distraught. Edit to add, mom ended up recovering with no complications. Baby was kept alive for 7 HRs before mom finally withdrew care and passed peacefully in her arms. Story 8. Emergency physician. I thought I had seen it all until a few months back, I had a septic lady who I couldn't figure out the source. Admitted her and she was a boarder in our ED overnight. Next shift, a nurse comes out of her room. Doc, I literally just caught the woman injecting something into her PICC line. Woman was injecting a slurry of her own chute into the PICC line. Yeah. Story 9. Case I saw as an ER resident. Warning, this is graphic. Severe burn victim, probably 70 full thickness burns. Bro in, barely alive, was trapped in a car that caught fire after a crash. His body was completely charred black from the mid-chest down. Parts of him crumbled off when EMS moved him to the stretcher. I have no idea how he lived long enough to make it to the hospital. It was the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. I think about him multiple times a month, and this happened 7 years ago. The trauma and ER attendings agreed that this was not a survivable situation. We were able to get an IV in his neck and put him on a fentanyl drip for comfort, and he passed very quickly. Thinking about the case makes me sick years later. I can't imagine what he had to endure. Never seen anything like it since. Answer. My uncle had a pretty bad on about 20 years ago as a firefighter. They had structure fire with the fire in the basement. He begins a walk around of a house and hears banging on the basement window. He looks over and sees 2 hands banging the glass, frantically trying to get out. He runs over, yells for help, and breaks the window. Him and another firefighter reach in through the smoke and find 2 arms, and when they went to pull him up, the skin comes off of his arms. They managed to still get him out, but he was basically 2nd and 3rd degree all over. He said he still can't eat baked or fried chicken with the skin on it because it reminds him of that man's arms. Story 10. First code passing I saw was an elderly woman vomiting poop. She had had a stroke several years back, and her doctors thought she was silently aspirating and was diagnosed with a pneumonia, but also constipation so bad it caused a bowel obstruction. Stool had backed up so far that it was causing reflux, which she also had been slowly, silently aspirating, and after a slow deterioration, she puked up all this old poop, coded, and died. When we did post-mortem care and rolled her to clean her and change her sheets, more poop vomit that had been in the back of her throat kept dribbling out of her mouth. Answer. As a student EMT, I had similar. Old man vomited his own chute into my face. His adult son was screaming at me he couldn't breathe, while old man was gargling through turds more suction. Was a great object lesson for when my parents got older, to not try to call shots for them. I'd rather die of hypoxia than choking to passing on my own poop, wouldn't you? Story 11. Doctor here, I once had a psychotic patient jump in front of a lorry, pretty much broke every rib on his right side and collapsed his lung. Here's the thing, he didn't die and actually managed to walk home, where he then sawed off both of his own feet and partially his right hand. Only found because the neighbor found one of the feet in his garden. Never underestimate what someone will do in extremes of mental health. Story 12. I've answered this before, so here it is again. Spoiler alert for triggered and squeamish. Don't read further. Skip to the end. Day off on vacation with another paramedic. On the highway, saw an accident happening in the distance. We were in the funnel to get by. No PD, fire, or EMS. On scene, and it was bad, so we stopped to help. This was early days of cell phones, but we had one, and called it in. I should have known by the smell what was going on when I opened my car door. Diesel, body parts, exhaust. I will never forget that smell. Internal organs have their own special smell, and if lavender was in that mix, lavender would repulse me for the rest of my life. DPS reports said a pickup truck at 80 mph blew a tire and went into oncoming lanes and hit an 18-wheeler at the pinch point, driving the 18-wheeler into the lanes of traffic the first truck originated from. This caused a head-on collision with a family car at about 120 mph combined impact, and the impacts from the vehicles that couldn't stop drove the family car under the cab of the 18-wheeler. The vehicles were so badly mangled, you couldn't tell it was a pickup. Triage is a system where you look at the injuries and decide who is going to get help. You look at dead or dying and realize you can't help them and move to someone else who is dying but you can save, and you help them. Had to do that. 5 fatalities. Pickup truck driver was in pieces, literally. 18-wheeler driver had to be life-flighted to trauma. 3 others transported to ER with serious but not life-threatening injuries. Hour and a half later, we were still trying to get the cab off the family car with a high crane-type wrecker, even though I had already given up hope of anybody being alive. Relatives of the family car had passed the accident but didn't see the car as it was crushed under the cab of the 18-wheeler and was unrecognizable. Returned to the scene when their loved ones they were behind weren't at home. DPS fire, EMS, and wreckers had been on scene for a while. My friend and I had taken a back seat to rescue efforts by this time and had cleaned up and were leaving, as we would only be in the way at this point when the family approached us to ask about the details. The rescue effort moved into high gear when I told the captain that the possible occupants of the family car was a mother, father, grandmother, and 1-day-old infant that had just been released from the hospital a few hours before. They were the other 4 fatalities. Ton of bricks, just as vivid as the day it happened. Story 13. Ex-EMT here, I always thought babies took time to be born. Well, that's not always the case. I was helping a woman who wasn't English speaking. She was very pregnant, and we kept trying to tell her to calm down, to breathe, but she was just screaming, and in a blink, a baby popped out into her sweatpants. We cut off her blue sweatpants, and there was a baby girl, just like that. It just popped out. Answer. My grandpa liked to tell of his experience of the births of his first 2 sons. This was back when husbands often weren't in the delivery room. Grandpa waited several hours to meet his first son, and he ran out of reading material. So when he took Grandma to the hospital for their second child, he brought lots more to read. He was surprised that he only had time for 1 chapter of 1 book before he was called back to meet the baby. Story 14. 1. A plant growing out of this homeless guy's obsessed jaw, some dude having priapism, sustained arousal, after having injected cocaine directly into his male body part, treated by pulling blood out from his male body part by hand Q 20 minutes, X 10 HRs. 3. A guy who carted his testicular mass into clinic with a cart. He was a farmer. 4. Another guy who we had asked to bring in a urine sample the next time we saw him in 2 weeks, who saved every drop of pee to bring to us. His wife was getting mad because he was using all her mason jars. Oh, so many good ones. Wild times, and I'm not even a neurologist. Story 15. I cut into a guy, and the bones in his body were green, like a moss green. Turns out he'd taken a lot of tetracycline as a kid, and that's what did it. Absolutely wild. Also undressed a deceased woman to do a physical exam. Removed her Johnny shirt, and it looked like there was a head of cauliflower growing out of her vulva. Worst case of genital warts I've ever seen. Answer. Were his teeth a normal color? I took tetracycline as a kid and can honestly understand why. One time a pill broke open and it was bright neon blue. That pill fudged me up, too. I was nauseous constantly on it, to the point I couldn't drink water anymore because I had been conditioned to associate water with getting nauseous because I would take the pill with water and immediately get sick afterwards. Story 16. We had a lovely, devoted lady who visited her barely conscious elderly parent for a long time. She came to see them every 72 hours. She was stealing the fentanyl out of the patient's patch and taking it. We only found out after she collapsed a few times and had to be revived. Really sad, she stopped visiting when the patch stopped being used. Story 17. Mental health crisis worker. L worked for a lockdown psych unit with a heavy SVP, intimacy violent predator, and just an all-around scary population of men. On this particular day, it was all female staff with the exception of one small man, and we are all tiny people. Management sucked and poorly and inadequately staffed all the time. We had an SVP M32 6'3", 375 bulbs. This man was a mountain who liked to hit his head on the wall until he had large open wounds on his phrased forehead. He loved seeing blood, playing in it, drinking it, collecting it, masturbating with it. It didn't matter where the blood came from or how he got it. It was just endless fun for him. The day prior, he had hit his head in his cell and needed to get his head stapled shut, and from there sent to our facility for mental health treatment. We had him on a 1-to-1. He had his back turned away from staff and used a psych pen to help dig out the staples. It quickly became apparent what he was doing, and my coworker hit the alarm, and the rest of us came running. Nursing saw and ran back to the station to get our lights out shot. The patient had half of them out and used his fingers to pull the wound apart to get the rest of the staples out. Once he realized he could put his finger in, he just started shoving his fingers deeper in the wound and trying to pull down in the wound, and then hit his head on the wall. Blood is splattered everywhere. Like, there was so much blood. It was like watching a real-life horror movie. Anyway, he turns to us with a soulless stare, flat affect, and drenched in blood. He says, "Your turn." He turns and looks at me and launches towards me, and I take off running. He's laughing like a god-darn hyena, saying, "Gotcha, it's just prank," and then proceeds to sit down and plate in the blood like he was in a splash pool. He was given a night-night shot and tripped to the ED. Answer: it's interesting to try to understand how does one's brain get misfired that badly. The first misfiring from blood to intimacy arousal is pretty easy to understand because brain actually differentiates poorly between different kinds of arousals and intimacy, and violence are relatively close physically, and that probably is why blood alternative tastes is pretty common in itself. But what this guy has is so much more than that, because obviously normal intimacy behavior isn't strong enough for you to routinely and urgently put your health and life in risk in completely avoidable way, no matter what you are turned on by. Story 18. We once had this really old, frail woman in our care who got a skin infection on her foot that just started getting worse and worse. It was becoming necrotic, so there were two options. Either they amputate it, but run the risk of eliminate her in surgery because she's that frail and old, or we do nothing but just keep cleaning it, elevating it, and bandaging it up in the hope that maybe it will get better and see yellow. It was a moral dilemma that only the family could choose, passing and comfort now, or later at the expense of constant pain. Her family were so fudge stupid and oblivious to her needs. They treated her as if she were still in her prime, despite the fact she couldn't swallow whole foods anymore. They'd give her solid foods and act shocked when she began choking and then would need to be rescued. Of course, they decided to not go through with the surgery for their mom, just to squeeze out another month or two of life from her. The most in denial, deluded family I've ever witnessed. Yes, it's sad when our parents die, but I would never prolong their suffering just because I'd feel sad when they eventually go. I was there once when the nurses cleaned out the wound and y'all, it was black. Black with literal bone visible. And no amount of painkillers could truly make her not feel the cleaning process. We repeated this process every few days. I held her hand as this nonverbal woman would just scream as it was cleaned. Everyone in my area cheered when she died. It's bittersweet being so happy and relieved for her passing because it meant she was finally at peace. Answer: last year my grandma was on hospice. I was the only person who took care of things. My alcoholic mom was Mia along with my aunt, and I was in charge of her care. She always said she wanted me in charge because I would do exactly what she wanted, and I was stubborn enough to ignore what the others said. She wanted no life-saving measures at all, but didn't want to be in pain. So I followed that to a T when hospice, and I went over everything. I had family complain after the fact that I should have done everything possible to save her. She had also said she didn't want any form of funeral and just wanted her ashes spread at a farm. So I did that, and they bitched that they didn't get to take time off work because there was no services. Then the best gift of all, they were excited to find out who got what from her $60,000 life insurance policy. Turns out she signed up for accidental passing and dismemberment. There was no policy payout. I paid for the crematory fees myself. They came sniffing around for money, and I got to tell them they could help pay for the cremation, and my new friend at the local funeral home even printed out itemized bills for me to hand out because we knew they would never pay. He was fantastic. Everybody fudge off, and I haven't heard from a single one since October. Greatest gift of all, Grandma. Story 19. Took care of a guy with frostbite to all 10 toes. He had gotten high on meth and walked 15 miles barefoot in the snow in a northwestern state. I came in to paint with betadine his mummified toes, and he didn't know he was going to lose them all. Some doctor didn't tell him. I stepped out to clarify and they told me to tell him. I'm an RN and they told me to let him know he was going to lose all 10 toes. I felt bad but did my job. He acted like it was nothing and just kept on making out with his girlfriend. I think he was still on meth because they were climbing all over each other while I was trying to do wound care. I finally told her she couldn't sit in his lap anymore while I worked. I couldn't believe they were acting that way anyways. I was just shocked that he was losing all 10 toes. They would self-mummify, break off, and he would be toeless and be fine with it. It was just weird. He was also in his early 30s. Story 20. Not a nurse, but my brother dated one. She assisted in a case where a homeless guy had been wearing jeans, and when they wore out, he just put a new pair on over the top of them, and then again later, so he had 3 pairs of jeans on. Never took them off, never bathed unless he jumped in a lake or whatever, and his leg hairs had grown through all 3 sets, so they had to surgically remove them. Story 21. Registered vet tech with 21 years experience. A 17-week-old kitten declawed at home because he scratched the owner while playing. The little dude also had all 4 of his canine teeth broken and his feet were burned with a lighter to cauterize the bleeding. I have 16 years of experience in ER. I've seen some shoot, but this is the one that made me cry while on shift. Anyway, previous owner was charged with felony animal cruelty and the kitten lives with me now. He goes to work with me every day. Edit. I cannot provide cat tax in the comments, but I am happy to provide the tax if you DM me. Answer. My sister has been a vet tech in an emergency hospital for around 14 years now, and hearing the little she's willing to talk about from work, I can say that you guys are 100 heroes. Knowing how much you all love animals and witness all that pain and just horrendous shoot, not to mention the people who should have never owned animals, and still go back to work the next day is so fudge admirable. You are a fantastic human, and thank you so much for what you do. I'm so glad that precious baby has a home with you. Story 22. I had a patient who was the victim of domestic violence. Her spouse poured boiling bleach on her face. The skin on her face was starting to liquefy from the combo heat and alkaline burn. She was intubated quickly for airway protection and sent to a burn unit. Story 23. Just before I retired, I was working as an EMS lieutenant, first rank of being a supervisor. I worked in a huge city that had a lot of different radio frequencies for different sections of the city. I was supposed to sit right on the border of Central and North and monitored both frequencies so I could respond to jobs without having to have the dispatchers relay the message. One night, the North got a call for a shooting. As I put it in gear, I hear another unit on Central get called to the same address for a cardiac arrest. My jimmy's fully rustled. I floor it and tell both that I'm responding. Upon arrival, along with police and a fire engine, we are met by the patient's girlfriend, who is sobbing, but motions us into an apartment that has been given an Event Horizon-themed makeover. There's just a comical amount of blood. We follow the blood into the bathroom and find a guy sitting on the toilet holding a towel against his head. He takes it away for a second, and there is obvious arterial spray from his temple. He says he's fine and for us to leave. The girlfriend says he shot himself. Neither are directly true. The cops start demanding to know where the gun is, but there is no gun. Dude shot himself in the fudge head with a crossbow the size of a large pistol. He made it to the hospital fine and likely made a full recovery. But as we were patching him up, one of the medics, one of the funniest people I've ever met, paused and said between the 5 firemen, 4 cops, 2 EMTs, 2 paramedics, and the EMS supervisor, there's got to be over 100 years of experience in this room. Any of you ever had a crossbow injury before? This was followed by a chorus of from everyone realizing how fudge bizarre this whole situation was. Story 24. One of the psychologists on our team was called in to deal with a new and distressed patient who'd been admitted and put in the tranquil room to calm down. While in there, he found a pen cap and poked hundreds of holes in the one wall that was drywall and shoot on the floor and used his hands to play dough factory shoot into each hole. The room had to be closed for 2 months to fully clean up and rebuild the wall. Story 25. First of all, you learn really fast to never say never working in healthcare. No matter how many years you do it, you will always see something for the first time, at the very least once every few months or so. That being said, there are still other things that shock me and/or creep me out no matter how many times I see them, including teratomas will always creep me out. I think a lot of people already know what they are, but for those that don't, they are tumors that contain several types of tissue, including hair, teeth, and fingernails. Just know the total lack of care for another's life. How people treat elderly family members is definitely on the list. The worst is always a parent's abuse of infants or children. You'll never forget a readout of a skeletal survey of a 7-month-old that had just passed, showing old and new fractures of pretty much every single bone in the body. Based on the aging of the fractures, that baby had to have been beaten several times pretty much every day of their life. Finally, you'll never forget a relatively young, think late teens or early 20s man who had shoved the rubber gripper of a pen up his urethra, male body part, because he couldn't pee. Answer: 2 years ago, my then 15-year-old daughter was in horrible pain. Took her to the ER. Her blood work came back wonky, so they did a CT, a teratoma the size of a duck egg on her right ovary. She had surgery a few days later to remove it. They tried to save this ovary, but the tumor had pretty much totally absorbed it. It was filled with teeth and hair. I did not tell her until a few weeks after the surgery what kind of tumor it was. I know my daughter, and she would have freaked out even worse than she already was. Story 26. A 8 by 10 sheet of paper, front and back K, 2 columns each side, list of allergies and intolerances that a woman brought to the hospital with her. Laminated. Included things like saline in plastic bags, wet newspaper, toilet paper, and tons of meds. Except narcotics, of course. Story 27. Kind of related. I worked in a pathology lab. If you don't know, a path lab is where all the gross stuff that either comes out of or comes off of a patient, e.g. tumors, moles, legs, arms, bodies, babies, dead, eyes, ears, breast implants, those weird twins that grow inside people, biopsies, etc., etc. It's a world of wonder. So one day a leg came down from a severe diabetic who had chose to let his necrotic leg fester. The experienced PA who was dissecting the leg as normal all of the sudden stepped back in terror and exclaimed, "Holy fudge!" And then he dry heaved. Now this PA did autopsies on the reg, and he was grossed out. Anyways, yada yada yada. When the pathologist cut into the leg, maggots came pouring out. A leg that was attached to a living, breathing human just hours ago. A mobile home for maggots that were just munching away at his leg while he was probably sitting at some Denny's days before. Story 28. Last winter, during a really cold spell, coupled with snow, I had a resident in the locked memory care I worked decide that the building was on fire. 2 a.m., he took a suitcase from his closet and threw it through the window in his room. He had a roommate who slept in a bed directly under the window. Suitcase guy crawled over his sleeping roommate and out the window to the firehouse down the road to get help. They called the police because they thought a homeless man was hallucinating. Night shift didn't notice any of this until roommate came out much later and said he needed another blanket because he was so cold and it was snowing on him. They checked, and sure enough, his bed was covered in glass and all. Helpful Harry was gone. It was a shoot show. Answer. My husband and I have rescued a few elderly people in our time. One got lost from his nursing home. Hubby kept him on his bus and contacted local police as he knew something wasn't the ticket. Badumtus, one got lost at our local shop. I drove her home. Yes, double-checked she lived there. And another one I had spotted walking along our street for an hour. I had to lure this one on with tea and cakelosh, but we contacted police and got her back home. Turns out dementia got lost, etc. We are a beacon for lost souls. Story 29. A guy whose blood pressure was so high, it caused a nosebleed so severe, he was bleeding out of his eyes. Also the amount of blood that can come from gastric esophageal varices when they burst. A few months ago, I suctioned close to a liter of blood from a guy's nose and mouth in the 10 mins we attempted to band his varices. It did not work. ICU put in a Linton tube. Took it out a few days later. He exsanguinated again and died. Really horrible. Answer. Oh God. My fiance developed bleeding esophageal varices due to complications from liver failure. Thankfully, we were in the hospital at the time, and they had to insert a tube like that, which in his case had to be weighted. It was horrible. I think they had to give him something like 6 units of blood, and then he ended up with pneumonia and went septic. Story 30. I've talked to numerous medical providers. I've heard some really tragic, insane, and unbelievable things. This remains the most unfortunate and craziest. I was coming off a 24 shift in the ICU when I was an intern. A woman had met up with some friends for Bible study and decided to spend the night at her friend's place. At some point in the night, the friend checked on the woman. Upon opening the door, she found the woman, 2 items, and a decent amount of blood. I'll pause the story for a moment for you to consider what those 2 items might be before continuing the woman. And 2 items covered in blood. The woman was alive, and the 2 items next to her were her eyeballs, both of them. Complete enucleation. She had forcibly removed both her eyeballs. No other objects were found. We think she did it with just her fingers. The paramedics brought her eyes with her in little saline bottles. You could see the optic nerve coming out the back and the little attachment points of the extraocular muscles that help turn the eye in different directions were visible as well. A clear liquid was seen running down her cheeks. I initially thought the liquid was tears, but it was cerebral spinal fluid leaking out the little holes in the back of the eye socket where the optic nerve enters the brain. Turns out she was schizophrenic and, we believe, read a Bible passage that mentioned something about if your eyes cause you to sin, you should gouge them out, or something similar. She survived, but is blind for the rest of her life. Tragic story. Story 31. The saddest was a dementia patient I had. The last 8 weeks she was alive, she would just cry and say the same phrase over and over. Turns out that the phrase was one of the worst days of her life. The woman was reliving her worst day ever on repeat every 10-15 minutes over and over and over, just bawling. And not that normal sort of crying, but that hit you in the gut. Their pain is so evident with their cry type of cry. I've never wanted euthanasia to be a thing more than I did for that woman. Answer: had a similar experience during clinical. We were on the hospital's neuro unit, and I was assigned this tiny little old Polish lady, unfortunately suffering from dementia. She was stuck in a concentration camp in her mind. Anytime we tried to clean her up, she would fight like crazy. I'll tell you, she may have been tiny and frail, but holy hell, you did not want her to get her hands on you. It was like being gripped by an eagle, and the look in her eyes was sheer terror. Why can't dementia patients get stuck with a Happy Times reel on repeat? Story 32. I'm an EMT. I believe I've posted this story here before, but here goes. Older female being horribly neglected by her husband caretaker. This older lady in her 70s fell down early summer, and we had a crew go out there, go check on her. She was alert and able to make her own choices. She refused EMS care and decided to stay on the floor. A few months go by, and we get called out there again. We walk into the small home and instantly smell human shoot-rotting flesh. She is still on the floor on the same side with a blanket covering her. We lift the blanket, and she only has a shirt on, is covered in shoot and piss with open, clearly infected wounds with maggots in them. She is able to grunt to pain and nothing else. There is weeks' worth of shoot in this tiny room she is in. Her husband is behind us yelling, "I can't do this anymore," and or her shoot. We call for help and PD and attempt to move this woman. We struggle to move her as she has been laying in the same spot for so long that she has been fused into the carpet floor by all of her bodily fluids. We rip her off the floor like a Band-Aid, which makes more wounds and carry her outside. Her poopy legs rubbed against my pants, and my partner got some form of fluids on him that ate through his pants. It literally looked like someone threw acid on this dude's crotch. P has us on body cam throwing up. We transport her, and she dies 3 days later to sepsis. PD decides not to pursue charges on her husband because he was too old. I was 19 and had 4 months on the job. When I had this call, my first year was trial by fire. Answer: have had a very similar situation, except this patient was brought to us at the ED. Daughter, middle-aged, fell, supposedly thought she broke her back, and I guess elderly mom was only one there. Don't know why, but the daughter was terrified to get up, so she just laid there. She would regularly aspirate on the food her mother spooned in, and then also develop wounds from laying in the same place. EMS reported pads stuck to her wounds as some sort of makeshift dressing. Of course, when she was removed from the floor, these wounds were torn further open and she was covered in her own excrement. She died days later of sepsis. Story 33. Exercise physiologist in a rehab clinic for heart and lung patients, many recovering from open heart surgery or aortic valve replacements. I've seen people not heed mine or the doctor's strict warnings to not do anything that could reopen the healing chest scar from then being quite literally opened up. But I had a patient whose inclusion site was raised in a bubbly-looking way when I was giving them a physical assessment. I mentioned that I don't like the look of it and told them to see the cardiologist ASAP, as well as I messaged their cardiologist and PCP personally to explain the situation. Both docs gave them the okay to come back and exercise. Well, it popped while on a rec bike from, I'm guessing, pressure buildup of fluid, because not only was there blood, but milky pus fluid leaking out with the blood. Another one a few weeks after that was a patient who I later found out was septic, having a 170 heart rate, and was so delirious he fought me verbally and physically, got a good punch to the center of my chest and face. When I called for an ambulance and refused to have him drive home. He drove to the clinic. I'm so happy he didn't cause an accident, and I walked around with a nice black eye for a bit. Luckily, I made a fun spin on it by telling patients a resistance band did it to me because I didn't follow proper safety precautions with them. Story 34. I used to volunteer for an organization that provided respite care for medically complex children. The most difficult thing I experienced was working with a girl who had a self-injurious stimming behavior. Stimming is a repetitive behavior that people with diagnoses such as autism use to self-soothe. Unfortunately, sometimes it can also be harmful, such as headbanging or scratching. Her stim was to forcefully reach behind her eyes into her eye sockets to attempt to pull them out. The solution was essentially keeping her hands busy with stimulating toys. But when it occasionally happened before I was able to redirect, I would gag in my mouth. I hope she's doing better behaviorally now. No instance of CPR or wound care has come close to that for me. Story 35. I was a medic in rural Nevada. Got a call for an old-timer who took a spill in a casino parking lot. Not major, but he had a decent laceration on his forehead, and old people and head wounds bleed a lot. I'm getting him patched up when there is a knock on the ambulance window. Probably a friend or relative, I think. Nope. I open the door of an ambulance covered in old man blood, and this entitled cunt tells me I'm blocking her car. Answer. Full assessment and treatment performed on scene, and as slowly as possible, I assume, had similar with someone parked in the ambulance bay at a doctor's surgery. Hissy fit about only ducking in for 5 minutes. Admittedly, we had space to let him out, but why? He was on the phone to his workplace explaining he was going to be late back to the office when some legend member of the public shouts full volume, "Because you parked in an ambulance bay, you fuckwit." Story 36. A 4-inch centipede coming out of the nose of a late stage, totally incapacitated female Parkinson patient. It's a nursing home. I dropped her meal tray and just cried. That was 30 years ago as a nurse's aide, and it haunts me still. Jack Kevorkian is my hero since then. She lived another 4 years like that. So wrong. Story 37. I've seen people break a window and shave the front of their thighs off to the bone, peeled tipsy people off the sidewalk that they were frozen to it because they peed themselves. I've pushed 3-year-olds off their mothers who were dying from a fentanyl overdose. I've pulled people out of intimacy swings to perform CPR, babies thrown in dumpsters in the middle of winter. I had a regular that rented his colostomy hole for people to F. People who don't have community found weeks after they are dead, and their decomposing body is starting to meld into its surface. Suicides, knife fights, gunshots, machete is popular here. I've gone into substances dens, gang holdouts. What surprises me is not how absurd something is anymore. It's who lives and who dies. People who took unimaginable damage walk away, and something as minor as a stubbed toe turns into septic shock and dies. I don't save anyone. Passing pics, it's time, not us. Story 38. 911 EMT fire department hastily requested EMS after a lift assist. Dude had wicked advanced skin cancer, and half his face, neck, and chest was down to dry bone. And as it got further out, it was various stages of decaying. His nose was gone, and you could see into his nasal pharynx and down into his oral pharynx via what was left of the roof of his mouth. Dude signed a refusal, wanted nothing to do with the ER or us. The fire captain was pissed we didn't just take him because he's fudge up. Yeah, no shoot Sherlock, but he can refuse medical care if he wants. Story 39. My brother is a volunteer firefighter, and they got called to the local substances house for a possible overdose. A police officer had arrived before they did. The police carry Narcan and can administer it, and one of the other residents of the substances house freaked out and thought the cop was there to arrest her. Her solution? Climb onto the roof of the 2-story house and fly away. She did get to fly, though, in a medevac helicopter. Story 40. I'm a firefighter that does a lot of animal rescues. Saw a pit bull jump off a 4-story roof and land on the concrete driveway. The dog was totally fine and ran up to us wagging his tail like it was game. Not a single injury. The fall must have been at least 40 feet. Why is it that when I misstep off a curb, I'm out for a week? Story 41. I'm an ICU nurse. The things I find most horrible now aren't probably what most people look for. It's human behavior. Anyone that does what we do will know. I don't see some of the things paramedics see, like young families dead on roadways, but I see people torture their elders way past expiration dates. But here are some of the more grisly, shocking things I've seen. Young fireman impaled from one eye through the opposite side of the skull, occipital. I got him from the OR and was touch and go all night and for weeks after. Still alive, doing okay. Blind, I think, in one side. Point blank shotgun blast to the thigh. 2 tourniquets. Flesh only held on by maybe a couple of inches of skin and a bit of muscle. I think she kept a leg, but IDK, how functional it is. Car crash with massive head trauma. Brain matter herniating out of both ears. Died, obviously. Beaten to passing with nunchucks. Jane Doe call girl. Strangled. probably dead a while before found and revived. Died. Stayed in a burning house. Slowly sucked out charred lung from his ET tube for a few days, and he slowly got worse respiratory-wise. Face destroyed by a buffalo. I think I have a lot, but I'd have to think these are just off the top of my head. The most dangerous thing we all do is drive. If you drive an open-air vehicle like an ATV or motorcycle, I would urge you to have good life insurance and a solid will and power of attorney situated. Story 42. Skeletonized calf and foot while still attached to the rest of the limb. Patient was abused and neglected by their caretaker. I've seen plenty of CLTI, critical limb threatening ischemia cases, but that patient literally only had bone and a little bit of tendon left on them. It was like it had already been picked clean by vultures and maggots. The patient ended up having a full amputation of the leg due to infection that had migrated higher up. Another one that I'll always remember is a rodeo clown that came into the ED after being pushed down and trampled by a bull. His testicles were smashed, like completely pulverized. There was nothing left to save. I think they ended up getting plastic surgery and prosthetic testes. Story 43. I was a nursing student a few years back. During clinicals, I saw a lot. In 1 week, I saw one of my patients lose a bit more of his foot from progressing gangrene that we just could not get ahead of for some goddamn reason. A colostomy bag seal failure that started draining into an open wound bed. I will never forget the smell. A guy with jaundice that was so bad that I thought he stepped straight out of The Simpsons and was bitten by no less than 2 separate dementia patients, one of which had C. diff. I didn't stay in the program very long, but I will never forget my time working in the hospital. For those of you wondering what happened, I was doing nursing through the Army, thus making a 4-year course be squeezed down into 1 year. And my instructors were, unfortunately, poorly equipped to meet the demands of the new NCLEX. That's the problem with being in a pilot program. The instructors are also trying to figure it out, and the Army didn't provide room for perceived failures in testing. Story 44. Social worker. Dude cracked an egg into a needle and tried to inject it to boost his testosterone levels. Massive infection that led to a few weeks in hospital. Came out just fine and enjoyed all the attention from the healthcare workers. Little more detail. I worked in the developmental sector for a while, in part doing direct work providing supportive housing to people. This was a trans man that received testosterone injections in-house by a nurse every other week, and the needles and testosterone were kept in his unit. Not once did he utilize his testosterone without the nurse's presence, but doing his own research, he'd read online that eggs could boost testosterone levels and made the leap that injecting it would be the most effective pathway. He came to the unit I was working in very scared, crying with a very red and inflamed arm, saying, "I think I made a mistake." 911 promptly called, and medical supplies in his unit transferred to a locked cabinet for the remainder of his years with us. Story 45. I had an intersex patient but wasn't aware that he was. I went to assist him with the bathroom, and he had a small scrotum but no male body part. He also had been sticking toy trains into his rectum. When asked why he didn't use safer intimacy toys, he said, "I'm not gay." Story 46. Old man went delirious after a tib plateau. He removed his DRSG and cannibalized his own leg, literally dug his fingers into the incision and ate his own tissue. Became infected, of course, and had a lower leg amp the next week, but luckily he didn't remember doing it after the delirium cleared. Story 47. I will tell my father's story of being an X-ray tech in Vietnam. I always, though, well, good, that's safe. No, he had to take pictures of what weapons of war do to people internally, children too, to see X-rays of children and babies shredded by bullets and shrapnel internally. How could anyone bear it? Story 48. Brain on fire. Never will forget walking into a room with a thunderstorm going on outside and a naked 21-year-old on the windowsill crawling around like a cat. Fudge horrifying, and instantly made me realize exorcisms were incorrectly diagnosed in the past. Answer. I survived this a few years ago. The worst part was the disease itself wasn't so bad, but being misdiagnosed and locked in a behavioral health unit for 6 weeks. I still have ongoing PTSD issues because of how I was treated. You ever suddenly become lucid in a calm down, read solitary confinement room, and have no idea where the hell you are? While you are in there, you realize you have to go to the bathroom, and you bang on the door and beg to be let out so you can use the bathroom. But the staff think you're just going through it or being intentionally belligerent, so they ignore you, and you're forced to take a shoot on the floor. The hallucinations were spectacular, though, and I wish we had the tech to record them from the POV of the person experiencing them. I know it was probably just massive amounts of DMT flooding my brain in preparation to die, or my immune system digesting my nerve receptors. But I went through the whole process of dying and being dead in what was supposed to be hell, but felt like a dark, bland purgatory and came out of it without no fear of passing. I still fear a slow, painful degradation until passing, but no longer the concept of being dead or what might come after. Story 49. Ex-EMT. We got toned out one night to a parking lot by PD for a fight. When we got there, you could tell it was a good one by the way the officers looked at us. Two sisters had gotten in a fight over a boy, and one of them bit the other's middle finger clean off. We spent a good 5-10 minutes looking for the finger in the parking lot, and my partner finally found it, except it wasn't like a clean bite on the missing finger side. It looked like the girl who did the biting had gnawed on it pretty good before spitting it out. Never could wrap my head around the chewing on the finger part. Story 50. I work in acute rehabilitation, so not as crazy as an ER, but I have a few. First was an elderly woman clearly not taken care of at home. Her toenails were so long that they curled completely under, like those goats with the curly horns. The worst part was that she had a prolapsed uterus, and her uterus had pressure injuries, bed sores on it. No idea why none of this was addressed during her acute hospitalization. Impossible that no one noticed, and they should have reported the family for negligence, but didn't, so we had to. Patient on for cardiac rehab after a CABG dropped in the bathroom, and we did CPR. His incision opened during compressions, and blood was everywhere. We sent him 911 back to the hospital he had a surgery in, and he returned to us after surgery and did great and was discharged home. These two are more emotional than gory, but the first is a patient who had a TBI who was very mobile after, but cognitively impaired. He was also very aggressive and mean, which was not his baseline at all. His wife was a nurse and was great during all our teaching sessions. Day of DCPT kept saying she wasn't coming, and we reassured him she was. Hours went by and she didn't, so we called and no response. We sent police for a wellness check and found her in the tub after taking a bottle of pills and an entire bottle of wine. She survived and admitted she felt like a failure being a nurse, but unable to emotionally deal with the significant cognitive and emotional changes her husband had. He went to a nursing home while she was in the hospital, and I'm not sure if he ever went back home. The second is a patient with Parkinson's who was end stage. His family had been withholding info from the outpatient neurologist about his decline, telling her it wasn't as bad as it was. I think it was part embarrassment. He had become aggressive and hallucinating a lot, and part they wanted him at home and not a SNF, even though he was more than they could handle. His wife had just been released from the hospital and came in with their daughter for a visit. He became aggressive and swung at his daughter, and his wife moved back to avoid getting hit and fell and broke her wrist. She died a few days later from a multitude of pre-existing conditions and complications. We discharged him and he died a week later in a nursing home. Story 51. Floated to the ER, and I can think of two that was new for me. First one was a 20-something schizophrenic PT that believed his male body part was causing him to sin, making him want to remove it. He achieved this by slipping his member through the finger hole of a pocket knife and left it for 3 months. Well, as you can imagine, it became necrotic, infected, and was only hanging on by a small bit of skin. I thought it was going to fall off when I lifted it to examine. The previous hospital attempted a Foley, and it came out the other side, and my God, the smell is something I don't think I could ever forget. Second one was a meth man who was BIBA, who attempted to remove his testicles with pliers. Just a massive mess of mangled ballsack and blood. Story 52. My dad discovered that his septum was deviated in just the wrong way. He found out when he started bleeding to passing through his nose. In and out of the ER several times trying to stop the bleeding until they cauterized his nose and put a balloon up there for a few days. Turns out the angle his nose was deviated created a perfect wind tunnel for the artery up there. And that's how everyone in the family got nose jobs, to prevent anyone else almost dying from nosebleeds. Story 53. A mother forcing a 3-year-old girl to sit on the heating element of an electric cooker as a punishment for crying, leaving a 3rd-degree spiral burn. The mother initially tried to claim the child had sat on the cooker herself. Not possible. She was arrested. Story 54. Ed Doc here. Have you ever seen a 4-year-old off their face on meth? I have. Whether or not it was negligence on the mom's part or intentional administration never really became clear, but either way, the depravity of people never stops being shocking. Story 55. My first year out of PA school, and I was working in indigent ARUC. A hermit wanders in with an eye infection he had for several months. I'd already learned to have patients take off their own bandages and clothing. Toes left in the sock was old hat by then, so I had him remove his bandage. The probable SCC had eaten both eyelids. Squamous cell carcinoma had probably started on the brow, but can start on the lid. His eyeball was a raisin on the floor of the orbital fossa. There was nothing left except a partially eroded orbital socket. Story 56. Nurse here. Once in the ER in rural Australia, I spent a whole shift looking after a man who'd been attacked with a machete. Story went, there was a Nigerian fellow on the run from the police who jumped a fence into his backyard. The man had just shot up some meth and thought that the guy in his backyard represented a threat to his 3-year-old daughter. So he grabbed a machete and went out and whacked this other guy in the head with it. The Nigerian guy reaches up, pulls the machete out of his head, and starts going to town on the meth man. Meth man ends up with hundreds of deep lacerations all over his body, head, arms, torso. You could see fat, muscle, bone, cut tendons, couldn't move some of his body anymore. Yet somehow he made it to hospital conscious and okay. The only arterial bleed he had was if he flexed his left wrist, suddenly there'd be a spurt of blood. It was interesting having to apply pressure to all of it. Tourniquets for the limbs, but that traps blood in the limb, which then causes venous bleeding in the lacerations, which need direct pressure. It's a bit of a balancing act. It was just a coppery stink of blood all through the emergency room. Guy ended up waiting for an air ambulance about 6 hours, then got lifted out. Nigeria guy ended up with a depressed skull fracture, but was really okay in the end. Story 57, MNRN. I watched a mother hold her dying 9-month-old due to her leaving this baby in the care of a substances dealer she just met. He beat the shoot out of her for whatever reason. She held her as she was dying, saying that she knew she was a good mom and this wasn't her fault. Mom has a very long history with CPS. I've never wanted to punch someone in the face so much. Story 58. Man covered head to toe in splinters. Not like the tiny slivers you work out with tweezers. Looked like he just came off set from a horror movie where the villain blasted through a wall or something. Just large pieces of wood up and down his body. Doesn't know what happened. It said he heard a sound like a gunshot and was suddenly in pain. Apparently it got cold enough that the sap in a tree froze and the whole thing just exploded while he was walking to work that morning. Story 59. I was a resident in the ER. Industrial accident, far away, some guy was planting a board, and something happened, and it got shot back at him. This 3-wide board entered through the tip of the guy's nose and exited through the lower right skull, right about where the neck and skull meet. We were a trauma center, but initially, this guy had been seen at some little rural hospital, and some absolutely legend of an ER doctor had gotten a breathing tube in and then shipped him to us with the board still in, as no one dared remove it. When he got to us, they're rigged up this crazy stabilization rig to keep the board in place. But there was still a good 3 feet of board out the tiny of his face and a splinter, maybe 3 out poking out the back. His face swollen to all hell, and looking at him, you'd shoot knew there was nothing left. Board would be going through where his brainstem would be. First, BC, this board is so long, we couldn't get him to CT scan. So their janitor is called and asked to bring all his saws. Then there's a surreal conversation between the neurosurgeon, the ER doctor, and the trauma doctor about how to cut it and what type of wood it is, and if it's a hardwood or a softwood. They tried to use a powered saw, but it caused too much vibration. So they ended up just very carefully and slowly sawing through this board by hand. Got it to cut to about a foot long so he could fit in the scanner. He goes off, everyone goes with him, and I'm left to put orders and stuff as the resident. At this point, discussions are about maybe he could be a transplant donor. I get the orders in and the guy gets the CT and comes back to the trauma room. Everyone else is in radiology waiting for the pictures to format. So the nurse comes up to me and asks for some sedation medications. I told her he wasn't doing anything and we were going to want to test his brain function in a minute. So I didn't want to give anything. Nurse, no, he's awake. Me, what? No, he's not. Nurse, no, he's fully awake. Me, it's through his brain. Nurse, go see. I run into the room and say, sir, give me a thumbs up on your right hand. Boom. Thumb comes up on the right. Oh, shoot. His face was still hamburger, so you couldn't see anything there, but he could clearly hear and process and act on it. We got him immediately on heavy pain meds and sedation, right around the time everyone else comes storming back to announce that he might be awake. Turns out EMS had given him a huge slug of something to keep him out during the transport. So immediately on arrival, he was still out and explained why we didn't see any movement. But after 20 minutes or so, he began to wake up. Turns out this wood board did not remain 3 wide the whole way, but but tapered as it went back to only about 14-inch wide. It went just below the brain, missed the brainstorm by literally 1 millimeter, missed all the important nerves, completely decimated his right lateral C1 vertebral body, transected his internal carotid artery and vein, but tamponated both of them so they didn't bleed. And he had been lucky enough to be born with a complete circle of Willis, an artery net in the brain, so he could get blood flow from the opposite artery to his right side and prevent his brain from stroking out due to the lack of flow. Dude immediately went to surgery, had the board removed and had repairs of his neck and face. He had about 5 surgeries, but here's the extra crazy part. Apparently, he walked out of the hospital like a week later. He had to be in a special collar for like 3 months, but his only long-term damage was going to be a probably permanently crooked neck. Was craziest thing I've ever seen. About 100 things had to go exactly right for that guy to not instantly die. I also saw a girl in a car accident who had a metal pole impaled through her pelvis that only broke the pelvic bone but missed every important organ, nerve, and artery. Story 60. It was something I heard from a patient's son. I was working as a hospice doctor, and occasionally we have cases where someone decides that they no longer want to be on dialysis, and they come into the hospice center for end-of-life care. It's actually a very pleasant way to die, and if I could choose, it's probably the way I would go. Anyway, most people have about a week to 10 days, and when I came onto the case, she had already been there for a few weeks. After a week, I decided to do some blood work on her, and it turned out that her kidney function was almost normal. Somehow, her kidneys had recovered while she was on dialysis. This was, of course, great news, and we started working on her discharge and where she would go since she had sold her house and everything had been moved months before. We were looking at assisted living options for her and found a very nice place. While I was checking on her the next day, her son was in the room talking to her, and I overheard him saying, "But this place is very expensive, and if you move there, you'll use up all the money you've been saving for me." Apparently, her not dying was interfering with the plans he had made for his inheritance. Story 61. As a med student, I saw at least 2 people put on involuntary psych holds because no one cared to verify that English wasn't their first language. I found one because I went to round on the psychotic man found wandering a parking lot, realized he wasn't speaking gibberish, just Korean. Fully oriented and was wandering that parking lot looking for someone to help him with his flat tire. 3. As an intern, first year of training to be an ER doc, finished coding a morbidly obese lady, rolled her once we called it to do a back exam, found one of her pet cats underneath her, also dead. Unknown TO'd for the cat. 4. Had a man who touched a very high voltage live wire, had 100 burns down to his bones, and the force of the electricity essentially blew off all 5 of his limbs. Smelled like burnt barbecue. 5. Had a lady show up altered, not moving her legs, and an EKG showing a heart attack. EMS told me she did a bunch of cocaine. Family later stated she occasionally smokes pot, but no HX of hard substances, and was by all accounts a pleasant woman. Anyway, she had an aortic dissection extending up her carotid artery and owned to her renal arteries. At that point, there was a blood clot cutting off all flow to the kidneys and legs. 6. Had a mentally normal 16-year-old swallow a bunch of magnets and give himself a bowel obstruction. Came in for right lower quadrant pain with normal ultrasound. MRI was down that day, so we got a CT scan to look for appendicitis because he never thought to tell anyone. Lucky MRI was getting maintenance at that time. 7. Young buck shot in the chest. Bullet missed his heart, but the shockwave and cocaine caused him to effectively also have a heart attack, coronary dissection. Those are just some off the top of my head. Story 62. I can see anything. It's the smells that get me. We had a homeless guy who was a bad diabetic come in during the middle of winter. He was suffering from frostbite, but refused to take off his boots for several weeks. He required bilateral below-the-knee amputations. Holy hell, that smell. I've seen shaken babies, and I wept for the person they could have become, die at the hands of an adult entrusted with their care. I've witnessed Gift of Life bully multiple families into organ donation while denying last requests for one final embrace before being wheeled back. I watched a teenage girl die on the table after getting shot in a case of mistaken identity. She and her mother went out to get fruit, and some gang members thought the car belonged to a rival. I'll never forget the scream from the mother after being told we lost her daughter. It was the sound of a heart being broken. Medical examiners are absolute pricks and take pleasure in making your job harder. They already know the answers to the questions they are asking. I lost a former NFL player who accidentally shot himself when the gun in his bag went off in a dealership after he dropped the bag in the floor. His femoral artery had been severed. We went through every unit of his blood type in the hospital. He was bleeding it out just as quickly as we were putting it in. The only reason he held on as long as he did is because he was in prime shape and trying to get another tryout. The smell of copper from all the blood on the floor remained in the room for hours. I'll never forget watching a mother cover her post-ATV accident brain-dead 12-year-old son up in a blanket before being wheeled back for an organ procurement because she said he looked cold. I had finally had enough of this when a surgeon I've worked with for years called me a fudge idiot for handing him the wrong instrument. Answer: my sister is an OR nurse. Some years back now, it was the day after Christmas, and she texted me saying, please promise me